that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. All you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We all have our reasons why we are on this track. Oh, we all have our burdens, yeah, but we just keep on fighting and we never look back. Here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne.
So we are on chapter 6 of Affirmative Action Around the World. Looks like my audio's good tonight. Surprise, surprise. All right. So there are only 7 chapters. The 6th chapter is Affirmative Action in the United States. So we're going to hear a little bit about stuff closer to home. Although the other stuff sounded a little familiar here and there, even though it was Indonesia and Sri Lanka and stuff like that. Okay, so Chapter 6, Affirmative Action in the United States. Affirmative action policies by the government of the United States confront a problem not found in many other countries. Both the American Constitution and statutes such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 mandate equal treatment of individuals. Advocates of official group preferences and quotas in the United States have therefore often sought to deny that these were in fact group preferences and quotas. Instead, such policies have been depicted as a correction or forestalling of discrimination, or as promoting diversity, quote unquote, whose social benefits are sweepingly asserted or assumed without actually being tested or demonstrated. The historical evolution of affirmative action in the United States would be difficult to understand without first realizing the legal obstacles which such policies must overcome in order to be acceptable in American courts of law as well as in the political arena. Group preferences and quotas in the United States evolved out of laws initially seeking to ban discrimination against individuals, including laws explicitly repudiating the principle of group preferences and quotas. The central statute in this evolution was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the central group whose plight provided the impetus and rationale for this law were blacks. As in other countries, however, these policies spread far beyond the initial beneficiaries. Blacks are just 12% of the American population, which I think it's 13 at this point, so it hasn't changed much since he wrote this. Blacks are just 12% of the American population, but affirmative action programs have expanded over the years to include not only other racial or ethnic groups, but also women, so that such policies now apply to a substantial majority of the American population. Put differently, failure to have statistical representativeness among employees can be equated with job discrimination for a wide range of groups, with the burden of proof to the contrary falling on the employer. Official group preferential policies go far back in American history. Religious discrimination existed in much of colonial America. Different laws applied to whites and free blacks in the antebellum South, and continuing legal distinctions between blacks and whites persisted during the long Jim Crow era that began after the Civil War and extended past the middle of the 20th century. Nor were blacks the only racial group discriminated against in law and policy. For the sake of the white majority, the indigenous population of American Indians were also subject to different and worse laws than the white majority, as were Chinese and Japanese immigrants. Ironically, however, the first official preferential policy for a racial minority in the United States appeared in the 1830s, long before racial discrimination laws were repealed. American Indians were given preferential employment status in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Rather than attempt to follow in detail the changing laws and policies affecting the many religious, racial, ethnic, and other groups at various times in American history, we can see in broad outline what has happened to American blacks, because this is the group most often used as justification for affirmative action policies. However, more widely, such policies have been applied to others. While this history is rather straightforward, what is a challenge is disentangling the myths which have become intertwined with that history. Myths versus history. In a history geared toward justifying current political policies and movements, blacks have been seen as a group whose economic and social disparities today are a direct consequence of their enslavement and maltreatment in the past, as well as continuing racism and discrimination in the present. Whether it is the lower incomes of blacks compared to other Americans, or their higher infant mortality rates, lower levels of marriage and labor force participation, or other social pathology, the general cause has been believed to be the behavior of whites. Accordingly, the socioeconomic rise of blacks in the second half of the 20th century has been seen as a consequence of laws and policies countering the discrimination inflicted on blacks by whites and attempting to redress past iniquities. Virtually all these widespread explanations of social pathology among black Americans are demonstrably false. Blacks have indeed been maltreated, first enslaved for more than 2 centuries, and then subjected to gross official discrimination for another century in the South, where most blacks have always lived. Nor was the rest of the country free of either racism or discrimination. But neither the initial poverty of blacks nor the later rise of most blacks out of poverty follows the path sketched by those who promote preferential policies. The facts of history contradict much of today's prevailing vision. While such things as the much lower labor force participation rates of blacks and the much lower marriage rates among blacks today are often attributed to quote unquote a legacy of slavery, in reality blacks had higher rates of labor force participation than whites and slightly higher marriage rates than whites in the late 19th century when they were just one generation out of slavery. Indeed, this continued to be true well into the 20th century. The drastically different patterns seen today began after the 1960s. Okay, oh, and we are in an ad. So, good timing on that. We'll just hang out for a second here. What is it? Charles Barkley. I don't know what it's about, but don't really care. I'm almost tempted to turn these ads off anyway because I don't make any revenue off of them. I don't know what they have done, but as far as you've got to have so many viewers before it gives you any revenue, I don't know. Anyway, so getting back to where we left off, which was I don't know, top of the page. Hey Vesper, how you doing? Good to see you again. So we're in affirmative action in the United States. Undoubtedly, racial discrimination has contributed historically to blacks having lower incomes than whites, but that is very different from saying how much or in what ways. It cannot simply be assumed that blacks would have had the same incomes as whites in the absence of racial discrimination, given that various groups of American whites have had very different incomes from one another at various periods of time. In addition, a number of non white groups in the United States, Chinese, Japanese, Asian Indians, and black Barbadians, have had higher incomes than white Americans. Moreover, one of the most serious forms of discrimination against blacks has historically been discrimination by government in its provision of education. Black white differences in per pupil expenditure, especially in the South during the Jim Crow era, have been extensively documented. Inferior education would assure income differences, even in the absence of employer discrimination. The point here is not to deny employer discrimination, either in the public sector or the private sector, but simply to point out some of the difficulties in determining its nature and magnitude, difficulties that are too often overlooked when equating statistical disparities in income or employment with employer discrimination. Although simple quantitative differences in education are not the only criteria of educational discrimination against blacks, historically the differences in this respect have been sufficiently dramatic to make it unnecessary to go into qualitative differences as well. Suffice it to say that blacks lagged substantially behind whites in education for most of American history. As late as 1940, non white males had completed just 5.4 years of school, compared to 8.7 years for white males. For young adult males aged 25 to 29 years of age, the black white difference was 4 years. 20 years later, the black white difference in schooling among young adult males in these age brackets had shrunk to less than 2 years. By 1970, the years of schooling for young black men in these age brackets was less than 1 year, 12.1 years of schooling for young black men compared to 12.7 years for their white counterparts. In short, black education rose substantially, both absolutely and relative to white education, in the decades preceding the civil rights legislation of the 1960s and the affirmative action policies that began in the 1970s. What economic changes accompanied this rise in black education? As of 1940, 87% of black families had incomes below the official poverty line. By 1960, this was down to 47% of black families. This dramatic 40% percentage point decline came at a time when there was no major federal civil rights legislation. But this was a time not only of rising black education, but also a time of a massive exodus of blacks out of the South, more than 3 million people, escaping both the Jim Crow laws and the substandard Southern black schools. In short, this was a time when vast members, it says vast members. I wonder if it's supposed to be numbers. When I'm going to read it as numbers. In short, this was a time when vast numbers of blacks lifted themselves out of poverty by their own bootstraps, quote unquote, as the phrase goes. Beginning in the 1960s, there were also major federal civil rights laws. While the percentage of black families with incomes below the poverty level continued to decline, to 30% during this decade, it is not so clear which factors contributed most to this, but it cannot be assumed arbitrarily that it was all due to civil rights laws, as too often it is in various political discussions. While it is an often repeated fact that the number of blacks in professional and other higher level occupations increased in the 5 years following passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, it is an almost completely ignored fact that the number of blacks rising into such occupations was even greater in the 5 years preceding passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. While the role of the 1960s quote unquote equal opportunity legislation and policies epitomized by the Civil Rights Act can be debated, the effect of the federal affirmative action policies that began in the 1970s are clearly less impressive. During the decade of the 1970s, the poverty rate among black families fell from 30% to 29%. Even if all of this one even if all of this 1 percentage point decline were arbitrarily attributed to affirmative action, it would still not be a significant part of the history of the economic rise of blacks out of poverty, however crucial affirmative action has been made to seem politically. Nor should this be surprising given that preferences and quotas in India and Malaysia have benefited primarily the already more fortunate rather than those in poverty. In the United States as well, affirmative action has been a boon to those already more fortunate. A study of a random sample of minority beneficiaries of government contracts set aside by the Small Business Administration showed that more than two-thirds of these beneficiaries had net worths of more than $1 million each. These include a black businessman in a position to offer to arrange a buyout of the multi-billion-dollar Viacom media conglomerate. This entrepreneur had previously been a government official at the Federal Communications Commission and thus knew from the inside how minority set-aside programs worked in the media. These programs also benefited wealthy black athletes like Lou Brock, Julius Erving, and O.J. Simpson. Yet, when some members of Congress publicly opposed such programs, Congressman Charles Rangel from Harlem compared them to Hitler and depicted any attempt to roll back affirmative action as an attack on all blacks. In reality, during the period from 1967 to 1992, most of this being in the affirmative action era, the top 20% of black income earners had their income share rising at about the same rate as that of their white counterparts, while the bottom 20% of black income earners had their income share fall at more than double the rate of the bottom 20% of white income earners. In short, the affirmative action era in the United States saw the more fortunate blacks benefit while the least fortunate lost ground in terms of their share of incomes. Neither the gains nor the losses can be arbitrarily attributed to affirmative action, but neither can affirmative action claim to have advanced low-income blacks when in fact those blacks fell behind. Because minority immigrants are eligible for affirmative action, even though they have obviously suffered no past discrimination in the United States, members of the Fanjul family from Cuba, with a fortune exceeding 500 million, have received government contracts set aside for minority businesses. An absolute majority of the money paid to minority-owned construction firms in Washington, D.C. during the period from 1986 to 1990 went to European businessmen from Portugal. Asian entrepreneurs have likewise immigrated to the United States and then acquired preferential access to government contracts. Such results once again demonstrate how far the reality of affirmative action departs from its rationale of remedying past discrimination. Although affirmative action began as a program primarily intended to benefit blacks, most of the quote, minority and women-owned businesses, end quote, favored by government preferences are owned by groups other than blacks. More than 4 times as many businesses are owned by Hispanics and Asian Americans, and 13 times as many businesses are owned by women as by blacks. Moreover, even within this omnibus category of minority and women-owned businesses, some evidence suggests that the vast majority of firms receiving nothing from these preferences. Um, sorry, I misread that. Moreover, even within this omnibus category of minority and women-owned businesses, some evidence suggests that the vast majority of firms receive nothing from these preferences, while a relatively few receive the bulk of the benefits. In Cincinnati, for example, the city vendor list identified 682 such firms, but 13% of these firms received 62% of all the preferential contracts and 83% of the money. Nationally, only about 1/4 of 1% of minority-owned enterprises were even certified as entitled to preferences under the Small Business Administration. Then, even among this tiny fraction of minority firms, 2% received 40% of the money. A special benefit has been created for American Indians who run gambling casinos on reservations, but here again, there has been the same skewed distribution of benefits seen in many other contexts. 5 states, with almost half the total American Indian population of the country, receive less than 3% of all casino proceeds, amounting to about $400 per Indian. Meanwhile, 3 states with only 3% of the Indian population receive 44% of all casino revenue, and an average of $100,000 per Indian. One casino in California brings in more than $100 million a year, or about $900,000 per Indian. These are revenues rather than profits, and many non-Indian investors reap profits from Indian casinos. The evolution of affirmative action. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not only a law mandating equal rights for individuals, both the congressional debates leading up to its passage and particular provisions of the act itself explicitly repudiated the concept of group preferences or quotas. The term discrimination, quote unquote, which sometimes has very different meanings to different people, was specifically defined in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to mean intentional actions by an employer against individuals, as distinguished from disparate consequences of particular tests or other criteria on different groups. The principal advocate for the act, Senator Hubert Humphrey, put it this way, quote, "The express requirements of intent is designed to make it wholly clear that inadvertent or accidental discriminations will not violate the title or result in entry of court orders. It means simply that the respondent must have intended to discriminate." End quote. While guiding the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through the Senate, Senator Humphrey assured his colleagues that it, quote, "does not require an employer to achieve any kind of racial balance in his workforce by giving preferential treatment to any individual or group," end quote. He pointed out that subsection 703J under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, quote, "is added to state this point expressly," end quote. That subsection declared that nothing in Title VII required an employer, quote, "to grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on account of any imbalance which may exist," end quote, with respect to the numbers of employees in such groups, quote, "in comparison with the total number or percentage of persons of such race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in any community, state, section, or other area," end quote. While the Civil Rights Act clearly did not create affirmative action in the United States, it is much less clear just what specifically did. In part, this is because group preferences and quotas arose and evolved incrementally and even surreptitiously. The very phrase affirmative action meant different things at different times. In the American context, there has been what might be called generic affirmative action, as well as highly specific affirmative action. Generic affirmative action is distinguished from a policy of passively adhering to a non discrimination principle, while waiting to respond to particular problems as they arise. Thus, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 required employers to take affirmative action, quote unquote, to ensure that their employees had a free choice as to whether or not to vote to be represented by a labor union. Such actions might include posting relevant federal laws on the subject in the workplace and or announcing the end of any anti-union activities or policies previously engaged in by the management. In other words, it was not considered sufficient simply to cease and desist from anti union activity and passively comply with the new federal laws giving workers the right to choose collective bargaining. It was necessary to affirmatively proclaim that right and repudiate any pre-existing policies whose lingering effects might intimidate workers in exercising their rights. Similarly, in the wow, when I fall apart, I fall apart. Similarly, in the much later application of this principle to racial and other groups, it was not considered sufficient for the employer simply to cease and desist from discriminating. It was necessary for the employers to take affirmative action, quote unquote, to ensure that previously excluded groups were made aware of new opportunities now open to them so as to be able to take practical steps to prepare for and apply for such opportunities. Affirmative action might also include voluntary efforts, both inside and outside the workplace, by both employers and others, to advise and train people for new opportunities in employment, college admissions, and other benefits. Such generic affirmative action has long had far wider support from the general public and from both conservatives and liberals in the political arena than more specific affirmative action in the form of group preferences and quotas. In short, there has been widespread support in the American population at large for efforts to bring less fortunate groups up to the existing standards, even among people completely opposed to bringing the standards down to these groups. The first official use of the term affirmative action in a racial or ethnic context was in President John F. Kennedy's Executive Order number 10,925 in 1961, where he said that federal contractors should, quote, take affirmative action to ensure that the applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin, end quote. This first in a series of executive orders extending over several administrations was clearly not calling for group preferences or quotas. On the contrary, it was calling upon employers to hire and promote without regard to group membership and to make that fact clear to all. It was generic affirmative action. The next major development in the evolution of affirmative action was the creation of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance in the U.S. Department of Labor by President Lyndon Johnson's Executive Order number 11,246 in 1965. In May 1968, this office issued guidelines containing the fateful expression goals and timetables, quote unquote, and representation, quote unquote. But as yet, these were still not quotas, for 1968 guidelines spoke of, quote, goals and timetables for the prompt achievement of full and equal employment opportunity, end quote. By 1970, however, during the Nixon administration, new guidelines referred to, quote, results-oriented procedures, end quote, which hinted more strongly at what was to come. In December 1971, the decisive guidelines were issued, which made it clear that goals and timetables were meant to, quote, increase materially the utilization of minorities and women, end quote, with underutilization, quote unquote, being spelled out as, quote, having fewer minorities or women in a particular job classification than would reasonably be expected by their availability, end quote. Employers were required to confess to, quote, deficiencies in the utilization, end quote, of minorities and women whenever this statistical parity could not be found in all job classifications as a first step toward correcting this situation. The burden of proof and remedy was on the employer. Affirmative action was now decisively transformed into a numerical concept, whether called goals or quotas. Affirmative action in this specific sense was thus a product of the decade of the 1970s. Many have seen the emergence of affirmative action in the sense of group preferences and quotas as a later perversion of the initial equal opportunity intent of the law. However, even before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, there were already developments which foreshadowed the shift to preferences and quotas. Moreover, this shift was in keeping with the underlying social vision of the problems of black Americans. If economic differences between groups were presumed to be strange and or sinister, then the obvious remedy was to eliminate such differences. The fact that such differences can be found in countries around the world and over centuries of history, often on a larger scale than differences between black and white Americans, may be known to some scholars and their students and readers, but these are still a minuscule fraction of the population, and certainly too small to have any political or even intellectual effect on widespread beliefs. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was being debated in Congress, there was already a prominent state case in Illinois in which the Motorola Company was judged to have violated state laws against discrimination by refusing to hire a black applicant who had failed a test they had given him. An examiner for a state agency considered the test to be, quote, unfair to culturally deprived and disadvantaged groups, end quote. Here the charge was not that this individual was given a test not required of other individuals, but that the group to which he belonged was less likely to pass such tests. The question of whether the law should focus on individuals or groups was joined early on at the state level, while the Federal Civil Rights Act was still under consideration in Congress. Supporters of the Civil Rights Act dismissed the Illinois case as an oddity unlikely to survive the normal legal processes, as a case where one examiner went too far, quote unquote, and as a, quote, red herring, end quote, as regards congressional debates over federal anti-discrimination law. But when one of the critics of the act, Senator John Tower of Texas, introduced an amendment to declare that an employer, quote, may give any preferential developed, I'm sorry, I said preferential and I don't know where I got that, quote, may give any professionally developed ability test to any individual seeking employment, end quote, and use such tests in making hiring or promotions decisions, Senator Humphrey said, quote, these tests are legal. They do not need to be legalized a second time, end quote. He also said, quote, the Motorola case has been discussed, and cussed, end quote. Despite their clear legislative history, the U.S. Supreme Court later ruled in Griggs versus Duke Power Company, 1971, that tests and other procedures which, quote, act as built-in headwinds, end quote, for minority groups, end quote, could not be allowed to stand even if they were, quote, neutral on their face and even if neutral in terms of intent, end quote, when they were, quote, unrelated to measuring job capabilities, end quote. This last proviso meant that employers had to validate any tests they used which had a disparate impact on minority groups. This apparently innocent requirement concealed costly and complicated statistical validation processes open to endless legal challenges that became, for many employers, simply prohibitions against using tests. The Griggs decision was not the only example of courts reading the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to mean precisely what the act and its legislative history had clearly said that it did not mean. A case that was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1979 was brought by a white employer of Kaiser Aluminum named Brian Weber, who had been rejected for a job training program for insufficient seniority, even though black employees with less seniority were accepted. This was because of the company's affirmative action plan, a plan voluntarily, quote unquote, established by the company to retain its status as a government contractor. Weber sued on grounds that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been violated by discrimination based on race. Section 703 subsection A of the Act declared it unlawful for an employer, quote, to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. End quote. And Section 703D more specifically declared it unlawful to, quote, discriminate against any individual in apprenticeship or other training, end quote. Notwithstanding this plain language, the Supreme Court voted against Weber's claim of discrimination. Writing for the majority, Justice William J. Brennan rejected, quote, a literal interpretation of these words, end quote. He claimed that the spirit of the act had as its primary concern the economic problems of blacks so that it did not bar, quote, temporary voluntary affirmative action undertaken to eliminate manifest racial imbalance in traditionally segregated job categories, end quote. Quite aside from the fact that these racial quotas were neither temporary nor voluntary, this interpretation ignored both the language and the legislative history of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which had rejected discrimination against anyone of any color, as well as rejecting ideas of correcting racial, quote-unquote, imbalances. Brennan's complete evasion of the plain words of the statute was described in a dissenting opinion as reminiscent of the great escapes of Houdini. The Weber case became both a legal landmark and a political model for evasions of the law by citing such rationales as remedial action or diversity, and for taking the issue out of the realm of government-sponsored discrimination, which would be a violation of the 14th Amendment, by maintaining that affirmative action quotas and preferences created by employers in order to maintain their eligibility for government contracts were voluntary and private. Although the Weber case was the high watermark for advocates of group preferences and quotas, the Supreme Court continued to go back and forth on the legality or illegality of particular affirmative action programs. Judicial vacillation was signaled not only by differing decisions on very similar cases. The same 9 justices had invalidated a University of California medical school quota in the Bakke case just 1 year before affirming the job training quota in the Weber case, but also by 5-4 decisions and by decisions in which there was no overall majority for the decision as a whole, but only shifting majorities made up of different justices for the particular sections that added up to the whole decision. Reconciling equal treatment of individuals with group preferences was not easy. Despite a zigzag pattern of judicial decisions over the years, the general trend has been toward even more expansive definitions of discrimination, quote unquote, leading to more and more, quote, remedial group, quote unquote, group preferences and quotas. In the controversies swirling around both judicial and political policies involving affirmative action, there has been much confusion between generic affirmative action such as outreach efforts and more specific affirmative action in the sense of group preferences and quotas. Indeed, much of that confusion has been cultivated by defenders of affirmative action who decry the notion that nothing should be done to help the less fortunate, which is, of course, not the issue at all. The real issue is what specifically shall and shall not be done, for whom, for what reason, and for how long. Such issues remain unresolved. As late as 2003, the Supreme Court of the United States declared in Grutter versus Bollinger that, quote, all government use of race must have a logical endpoint, end quote. Yet the court neither imposed such a time limit nor provided any criterion by which anyone could know when that limit had been reached. Extensions of affirmative action. As in other countries, affirmative action in the United States has not merely evolved but spread. It has spread to a succession of groups, to a wider range of activities and industries, and the meanings of words have also spread, so that discrimination, for example, now encompasses things that no one would have considered to be discrimination when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. Extensions of discrimination. Because discrimination so often serves as a predicate for preferences and quotas under American laws and policies, the definition of discrimination has tended to expand over time, along with the groups and activities to which affirmative action has been successively extended. The intentional act which constituted discrimination, as described by Senator Hubert Humphrey when he successfully led the effort to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, has long since been superseded by more expansive concepts and more vague and shifting standards of proof. The most decisive shift in the burden of proof has been to make the accused disprove a prima facie case of discrimination based on statistical disparities in group results. These may be disparities in test results or disparities in group representation, quote unquote, among employees of businesses or students admitted to college, for example. The Griggs decision by the U.S. Supreme Court shifted the burden of proof to employers whenever tests were passed at very different rates by different segments of the population. This became known as the principle of, quote, disparate impact, end quote, which was applied not only to tests but also to other criteria such as academic credentials or a non-criminal history, when these criteria led to different proportions of different groups being accepted. The policies of federal administrative agencies codified and extended the principle that lesser performances by A were to be regarded as presumptively the fault of B, the latter being left to try to prove a negative so as to avoid a charge of discrimination. Guidelines issued by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission declared that, quote, a selection rate for any race, sex, or ethnic group which is less than 4/5 of the rate for the group with the highest rate will generally be regarded by the federal enforcement agencies as evidence of adverse impact, end quote, of the selection process. The definition of discrimination was often accompanied by denials that this represented a lowering of standards. The argument has been made that no one was being forced to hire people who were not qualified, but this word sidestepped the real question, which was whether people of lesser qualifications were to be hired in preference to people of greater qualifications simply because of the respective groups to which they belonged. The word qualified essentially homogenized applicants who met whatever minimum standard might be arbitrarily set by third parties. If that standard were to be set as correctly answering half the questions on a test, then someone who answered 51% correctly was just as much a part of the qualified pool as someone who answered 99%. More important, an employer who hired proportionately fewer black qualified applicants than white qualified applicants could be considered to be engaging in racial discrimination, even if the average test scores of the black applicants were substantially lower. Moreover, this was not officially considered to be a policy of racial preferences, but only an application of anti-discrimination law. The boldest application of this principle was race norming, quote unquote, of tests. The U.S. Employment Service, for example, reported the percentile rankings of job applicants to employers without informing those employers that these were separate percentile rankings according to the racial group to which the applicant belonged. Thus, a black job applicant who ranked at the 90th percentile among fellow blacks might have a lower absolute score than a white applicant who ranked at the 80th percentile among whites. In Sri Lanka, the same practice was called by the innocuous name standardization, which offset the higher average academic performances of Tamil students as compared to Sinhalese students. In both countries, it was simply a disguised form of group preferences. When the clandestine practice of race norming became known and a matter of public controversy in the United States, it was banned in the Civil Rights Act of 1991. However, the kind of thinking it involved was not banned and has continued in other guises. Moreover, that such a practice could have been imposed secretly in the first place and persist undetected for a decade suggests some of the difficulties of attempting to ban affirmative action, and especially of trying to have a nuanced reduction of it, to mend it, not end it, quote unquote, as some have said. Anything short of unequivocally banning it outright simply invites such subterfuges. Indeed, even outright bans on group preferences in admissions to state colleges and universities in Texas and in California have set off searches for non-objective criteria, such as have already been used in India to circumvent court limitations on group preferences there. In addition, laws have been passed to admit students who finish in the top 10% of their high school classes in disregard of the highly disparate qualities of different high schools. Excuse me. And more particularly, the very low quality of the high schools from which many minority students graduate. Thus, students with composite SAT scores below 900 have been admitted to the University of Texas because they were in the top 10% of their high schools, while other students with SAT scores hundreds of points higher, some over 1,500, have been rejected. In California, the search for non-academic criteria for granting admissions to the University of California has in practice meant the use of such criteria to admit more Hispanics, but not Asian Americans, who meet those same non-academic criteria, in addition to having higher academic credentials. It is race norming by another name. The ease with which discrimination charges can be made with statistics alone, and the difficulty or impossibility of proving a negative when the burden of proof shifts to the employer, provide incentives for businesses to locate away from concentrations of blacks, for example. Whether the jobs lost by blacks as a result of such location decisions are greater or less than the jobs gained by blacks as a result of racial preferences is another empirical question seldom asked, much less answered. Here, as in other countries, affirmative action tends to be discussed and debated primarily in terms of its rationales and goals rather than its actual consequences. Extensions to other groups. Uh, Hold on just 1 second. Sorry. Wow, we have a long way to go in this chapter. I mean, a long, long way. I am not going to make it through this without taking a break and getting some water. Yeah, we're like maybe halfway through this chapter. that's what I was wondering. Extensions to other groups. Okay. All right. I'm going to go out for a smoke then. Yep, I am going to take a quick break just to get some water and or my voice won't hold out to finish this chapter. So I will be back in just a couple minutes.
Prepare to die. Prepare to die.
All right, let's get back to it, shall we? I got my water, a little bit of special water. All right, so I was just getting to extensions to new groups. The rationale of remedying or forestalling the effects of discrimination extends well beyond the various racial or ethnic groups originally used as reasons for creating affirmative action policies. The largest of these new groups, indeed larger than all the other groups put together, are women. And of course, in the United States, most of these women are white. Although the rationale has wandered far from the legacy of slavery argument, the practices growing out of affirmative action have not wandered far from the practices used in situations involving blacks. Women have become entitled to employment quotas and business set-asides like other groups. The need for specific evidence of prior specific harm has likewise been evaded, in this case by the phrase glass ceiling, that is, discrimination that cannot be seen, but which is simply assumed as a basis for preferential treatment. Women have even had a fictitious history created for them, much as there has been a fictitious history of the rise of blacks from poverty. In reality, the socioeconomic history of women in the United States is very different from the socioeconomic history of blacks, and even more radically different from the history depicted by those seeking affirmative action for women. Unlike the more or less continuous rise of blacks from lower to higher levels of education and from lower to higher occupational levels during the 20th century, women's educational and occupational trajectories varied considerably during that century. Although the conventional explanation of women's lag behind men in the economy is discrimination, and their rise in more recent times has been credited to feminism, to feminist or women's liberation movements that began in the 1960s, and the government laws and policies created in response to such political efforts, the cold fact is that women were in many ways better represented in higher occupational levels in the 1930s or earlier than in the 1960s. This can scarcely be credited to movements that had not yet begun in these earlier times, much less to affirmative action policies that began in the 1970s. Hey Vesper, yeah, I've only read like 2 paragraphs, so um, no worries. You didn't miss much. He's just talking about affirmative action for women and how it got started. Unlike what happened in the history of blacks, women's percentage share of the jobs in professional and technical occupations declined in the middle decades of the 20th century and then rose later. A similar pattern of fall followed by rise can be seen in women's percentage shares of the college and university degrees required for such occupations. Women's representation in professional and technical occupations declined by 9% from 1940 to 1950, and then by another 9% from 1950 to 1968. As far back as 1902, women's share of the people listed in Who's Who was more than double their share in 1958. Women received 34% of the bachelor's degrees in 1920, but only 24% in 1950. They received just over 15% of the doctoral degrees in 1920, but just under 10% in 1950. In mathematics, women's share of doctorates declined from 15% to 5% over a period of decades, and in economics from 10% to 2%. These were similar decline. There were similar declines in women's shares of doctoral degrees in the humanities, law, and chemistry. For no year during the 1950s or 1960s did women receive as high a percentage share of all master's degrees or of all doctoral degrees as they had back in 1930. If statistical disparities between women and men are attributable to discrimination by men, then this remarkable history would suggest that men inexplicably became more discriminatory toward women during the first half of the 20th century and then relented later in the second half, causing the trend to reverse. However, this whole puzzling and politically inconvenient question does not even arise in discussions where the educational and occupational history of women in the early 20th century is ignored and trends are plotted only for the period since 1960. Such ignoring of an inconvenient earlier history has been the rule rather than the exception in discussions of discrimination against women and of the presumed need for affirmative action to overcome that discrimination. In reality, the fall and later rise of women in their education and occupations relative to men is far more strongly correlated with demographic trends than with political, legal, or ideological trends. As women began having fewer children, a trend that began in the 19th century and continued on into the 1930s, they became better represented in higher levels of education and professional occupations. Then, when birth rates began to rise again from the 1930s to the 1950s, the baby boom, women began to be less well represented in these higher educational and occupational levels. The role of men in all this was primarily that of fathers of the children born to women. If this period of relative occupational retrogression were due to men's actions as employers, then it would be hard to see why the very same trends occurred in the hiring of faculty at women's colleges run by women administrators. Alumni of women's colleges returning for class reunions in the later period were often surprised to find male professors far more common in women's colleges than in the days when these alumni were students. After the birth rate began to decline again in the 1960s, women's representation in higher levels of education and occupations began to rise again. The crucial role of marriage and childbearing on women's economic level can also be seen by breaking down the female population as a whole into those who do and those who do not become wives and mothers, those whose careers are continuous, and those who interrupt their careers to assume domestic responsibilities. As far back as 1971, women who remained unmarried into their 30s and who had worked continuously since high school earned slightly more than men of the same description. Academic women who never married averaged slightly higher incomes in 1968 and 1969 before affirmative action than academic men who never married. Substantial male-female differences in income reflect the fact that most women do get married, do have children, and do interrupt their careers for domestic responsibilities more often than men do. Different occupations have different rates of obsolescence of their respective skills, so that so that interruptions of careers in some fields are more damaging to one's career than in other fields. For example, a physicist loses about half the value of his or her knowledge from a 6 year layoff, but it would take a historian more than a quarter of a century to suffer a similar loss. Women tend to specialize in occupations where career interruptions are easier to accommodate, teaching rather than computer engineering, for example. Another factor in male female differences in earnings is that men tend to specialize more in hazardous occupations that pay higher compensation. Although men are 54% of the workforce, they account for 92% of job related deaths. Innumerable other economically relevant differences between the sexes exist, even with men and women who seem to be the same superficially, and whose different incomes cannot therefore be automatically attributed to employer discrimination. As for the effect of women's liberation movements and government legislation in increasing women's income relative to that of men, there is no evidence of any such trend for those women who worked full time and year round over the period from 1960 to 1980. What was happening over this span was that more women were working full time and year round, both absolutely and relative to men. This says nothing about how employers were treating given women or how successful women's liberation was. A significant increase in the ratio of female to male earnings began in the 1980s during the Reagan administration, which is not when most feminists would claim that their influence began to be felt. While women are the largest group to whom affirmative action has been extended, there are others who have benefited from similar extensions of this principle and who are similarly remote from the legacy of slavery, quote unquote, rationale or rationales based on lingering effects of past discrimination. These include not only various immigrants from Latin America, Europe, and Asia, but also Eskimos who have been granted preferential status in Virginia, where it is doubtful that many of their ancestors ever lived, much less suffered discrimination. Even for women with the quote unquote lingering effects of past discrimination argument is far less weighty than it is for blacks or American Indians, for example. Since women are descended from men as well as women, there is no evidence that whatever disadvantages their mothers, grandmothers, etc. suffered had more impact on their current socioeconomic condition than the corresponding advantages enjoyed by their fathers, grandfathers, and other male ancestors. Successive extensions of the principle of affirmative action to more and more groups adversely affect both blacks and whites. As of 1970, blacks were two-thirds of all people in racial or ethnic groups legally entitled to affirmative action, but a quarter of a century later, blacks were just 49% of such groups. Moreover, this does not count the effect of the extension of affirmative action to women, mostly white women. With the addition of women, what affirmative action amounts to is legalized discrimination against the residual non-preferred population, mostly white males. None of this makes man, when I lose it, I lose it again. None of this takes into account the illegal or semi-legal uses of affirmative action which have occurred in the United States as in other countries. Minority businesses preferentially awarded government contracts, for example, can then turn over the actual work of fulfilling those contracts to others, in essence, collecting a royalty for letting non minority firms rent their minority status to acquire business from the government. The Alibaba enterprises found in Malaysia and Indonesia have their counterpart in American firms ostensibly owned by blacks, but in fact serving as fronts for whites. And we're in an ad. Damn it, Jim. Okay, I'm not sure where we left off until I saw it flash on my phone that the ad had started. So I'll just go back to the beginning of that um, paragraph when we come back from the ad. which is in 20 seconds. So what do we got going on? Food, emergency food, high energy bars, 20-year storage life. Hmm, I've never seen that brand before. They look like the cookies that everybody else creates for their compressed food. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the beginning of that paragraph. Minority businesses preferentially awarded government contracts, for example, can then turn over the actual work of fulfilling those contracts to others, in essence, collecting a royalty for letting non minority firms rent their minority status to acquire business from the government. The Alibaba enterprises found in Malaysia and Indonesia have their counterpart in American firms ostensibly owned by blacks, but in fact serving as fronts for whites. A Baltimore grand jury was kept busy for months exposing such fronts, and an investigation of quote, disadvantaged business enterprises, end quote, in Indianapolis ended up decertifying more than one-third of all businesses with that designation. At the individual level, jobs, promotions, and government contracts may go to people with only minute traces of some minority ancestry. And an entrepreneur who has 160 who was 164th Cherokee Indian won a set-aside contract in California, or with the effrontery to claim minority status fraudulently. The successive extension of preferred status to more groups, both legally and illegally, not only dilutes the benefits for those for whom the original rationale is strongest, it changes the terms of competition in ways that can work to the further disadvantage of genuinely less fortunate groups. For example, where group preferences must masquerade as anti-discrimination policies, employers have incentives to use employment and promotion criteria which can pass muster in court so as to avoid discrimination charges, whether or not these are the best criteria for assessing the ability to do the jobs in question. Objective criteria such as diplomas and degrees thus acquire greater weight than they might otherwise have. As in other countries, the genuinely less fortunate, black males from the ghetto, for example, are less likely to have these credentials as compared to white women, who are also legally entitled to affirmative action. Whether the advantages that black males acquire over white males as a result of affirmative action outweigh the disadvantages they have relative to white women is an empirical question, but it is a question unlikely to be asked. Private businesses. In the United States, as in other countries, businesses closely controlled by government have tended to have different hiring standards for different groups to a greater extent than businesses operating more freely in a competitive marketplace. In the United States, blacks were more likely to be discriminated against in government regulated businesses before the civil rights era, and more likely to receive preferential hiring in such businesses after that era. The telephone industry, before the breakup of the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, was a classic example of a heavily regulated enterprise with a monopoly in its markets nationwide. As of 1930, there were approximately 235,000 telephone operators in the United States, of whom just 331 were black. In all categories of telephone company employees, black males were 1.2% and black females 0.2%. Male employees included many manual laborers doing such work as digging holes for telephone poles, while the women were predominantly operators. As late as 1950, black women held only 1% of all jobs in the telephone industry nationwide. In the South, few blacks were employed as telephone operators during the entire decade of the 1950s, and they failed to reach even 1% as late as 1960. Between 1950 and 1960, the number of telephone operators employed in the southern states increased by 6,611, while the number of black telephone operators increased by just 2020. Meanwhile, outside the South, the number of black telephone operators rose rapidly during the decades of the 1950s, both absolutely and relative to white telephone operators. In fact, the increase in the number of black telephone operators nationwide exceeded the total increase in the number of telephone operators nationwide. In short, there were dramatic changes in the employment of black telephone operators during the decades of the 1950s, the decade of the 1950s, virtually all of it outside the South, with more than two-thirds of this increased employment of black women employed in the telecommunications industry occurring in just 5 states: New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio. How can this pattern be explained, and what does it imply? Although AT&T's nationwide operations such as long-distance service were regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, the individual phone companies were regulated by their respective state governments. The immediate post-war years saw changes in racial attitudes and in-state anti-discrimination legislation outside the South. The number of black women working as telephone operators in New York City, for example, tripled during the 1950s, even though the total number of telephone operators in the city remained virtually unchanged during that decade. In San Francisco, the number of black women hired as telephone operators tripled during the same decade, while again the total number of telephone operators remained virtually unchanged. In Detroit, the number of black women who were telephone operators increased fivefold, despite a slight decline in the total number of telephone operators in the city. No such dramatic changes occurred in such southern cities as Atlanta, Birmingham, Dallas, or New Orleans, nor in such border cities as St. Louis or Washington, D.C. The point here is not to claim that these racial employment policies were a direct consequence of orders from state regulatory commissions. Prior to 1970, public utility commissions generally did not seek to influence the racial hiring policies of the companies they regulated. Instead, the point here is that the very fact of being a regulated public utility made preferences for or against any given group less expensive than they would have been in a free competitive market. For a regulated monopoly, any additional costs associated with discrimination against qualified applicants could simply be passed on to customers. Thus, it was virtually costless to discriminate against blacks in an earlier era, and it was virtually costless to show them preferential treatment in a later era. In other words, public utilities could reflect prevailing social views at little or no cost to themselves, whether those views favored or opposed the hiring of blacks. To some extent, the same reasoning applies to non-profit organizations such as academic institutions, hospitals, and foundations. Accordingly, it is not surprising that most American colleges and universities had no black tenured professors until 1940, and few black or Jewish professors at Ivy League institutions until well after World War II. As of 1936, only 3 black PhD holders were employed by all the white colleges and universities in the United States. By contrast, more than 300 black chemists alone were employed in private industry at the same time. To private industry, these black chemists represented profits that could be made by hiring them. But to a college or university chemistry department, there was no such incentive, and they could easily afford to pass over these chemists. In later decades, the evolution of affirmative action, along with the still surviving anti-discrimination laws, created a dilemma for many businesses. If they failed to have enough, quote unquote, black employees, they were liable to be sued for discrimination by individual blacks, by civil rights groups, or by government agencies acting on their behalf. However, if they engaged in preferential hiring of blacks, they could be sued for discrimination by whites. Court decisions legitimizing affirmative action under prescribed conditions then provided businesses with a set of guidelines that could minimize their legal jeopardy. Therefore, when efforts were made to end group preferences and quotas during the 1980s by some within the Reagan administration, big business support for the continuation of affirmative action helped doom the efforts to rescind it. In addition, large corporations tend to have their own internal affirmative action officials and departments with their own vested interests in the continuation of such policies. In the year 2000, several large corporations filed briefs supporting the continuation of affirmative action at the University of Michigan. The academic world. Nowhere is affirmative action more deeply entrenched than in the academic world. Moreover, that world has a special importance as the gateway to upward mobility. Various arguments have been made for the admission of Black, Hispanic, and American Indian students to colleges and universities under lower standards than those applied to white or Asian American students. Chief among these is the claim that conventional criteria such as test scores and academic records do not reveal these students' real ability or likelihood of success. Over the years, this has been one of the most repeatedly studied and repeatedly refuted claims. Black students with low test scores do not perform better academically than white students with the same low test scores. On the contrary, black students tend to perform slightly less well than white students with the same test scores, and this applies across the board, not just with low scoring students. Other claims made as rationales for preferential admissions of black or other minority students have tended to be either not testable empirically or not to have been subjected to any empirical test. One of these claims is that diversity enhances the educational experience for all students. Typical of this genre of claims was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education titled, quote, Why Affirmative Action Works at Michigan, end quote. But the article, in fact, provided no empirical evidence of either why or whether it works by any definable standard, but only assertions and anecdotes. Often, a related claim is made that black students must be admitted in numbers sufficient to provide a certain critical mass on campus that will enable individual black students to feel socially comfortable and secure enough to be able to do their best work. Again, empirical evidence in support of this proposition is neither asked nor given. Conceivably, one might get data from colleges and universities with relatively few black students and comparable institutions with more substantial numbers of black students, and then compare these students' academic performances. Nothing of the sort has been done by proponents of the critical mass theory. Alternatively, one might compare the academic performance of black students in past eras in predominantly white academic institutions where there were only a relative handful of black students at the time with the academic performances of later generations of black students in the same institutions which now have a better approximation of the critical mass. But this too remains undone, nor is there any incentive for proponents of affirmative action to do such studies when their unsubstantiated assertions are so widely accepted and repeated. Some data that might be relevant to the critical mass theory come from the history of all-black Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. Between 1892 and 1854, Amherst College admitted 34 graduates of this school. Of these, 25 graduated from Amherst. 74% of the admittees and 21% of these. What? Whoa. Let me back up here. What? I'm getting a little bit mixed up here. Some data that might be relevant to the critical mass theory come from the history of all-black Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. Between 1892 and 1854, Amherst College admitted 34 graduates of this school. Okay. Of these, 25 graduated from Amherst. Okay, of the 34, 25 graduated from Amherst. 74% of the admittees and 21% of these black graduates were Phi Beta Kappas. There were never enough black students at Amherst during this period to constitute a critical mass. The contrast between the academic achievements of these early black pioneers at Amherst and the widespread academic failures of black students of a later era is much more consistent with the opposite theory of John H. McWhorter, a black professor at the University of California at Berkeley, that an anti-intellectual black subculture reduces black students' performances well below what they are capable of. If so, then a critical mass is likely to be counterproductive academically. Further evidence of the negative potential of a critical mass comes from numerous reports by observers of black students in schools across the country that these students have developed a habit of referring to fellow black students who are academically oriented and academically achieving as acting white, quote unquote. A charge that can bring anything from social ostracism to outright violence. A recent empirical study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that a higher percentage of quote, a higher percentage of black schoolmates has a strong adverse effect on achievements of blacks, and moreover that the effects are highly concentrated in the upper half of the ability distribution, end quote. In other words, black students with higher ability perform less well when there are more black students present. Yep, could have told you that. Another bit of empirical evidence comes from a study of the academic consequences of ability grouping in schools, which concluded, quote, schooling in a homogeneous group of students appears to have a positive effect on the achievements of high ability students' achievements and even stronger effects on the achievements of high ability minority youth, end quote. In other words, black youngsters with high ability improve particularly well when put among other high ability youngsters rather than being educated in the presence of other students of lesser ability. An intellectual critical mass produces opposite results from a racial critical mass. Which is the biggest argument against them doing away with AP courses in certain states, on the left coast especially. They did away, or were talking about doing away with advanced placement courses because it was unfair to minority students. And this is the argument against that. Okay, back to the reading. Still another bit of evidence comes from a study of graduation rates in state colleges and universities in Colorado. This study found that, in general, whites graduated at higher rates than blacks at most of the institutions studied. However, quote, for the two instances in which blacks graduated at higher rates than whites, we are dealing with extremely small sample sizes for the blacks, end quote. In short, it was precisely where they lacked a racial critical mass that the black students did markedly better. All this is more consistent with the McWhorter thesis than with the critical mass theory. However, it is not necessary to claim that this evidence is conclusive or even to choose between competing theories of the effects of a critical mass on black students in a given institution. The more fundamental point here is that the assumption that a critical mass is not only academically beneficial but academically essential has become prevailing dogma without empirical evidence being asked or given. A companion dogma is that black role models, quote unquote, are essential to the education of black students. Another widely trumpeted belief for which evidence has seldom been asked or given. In 2003, long after role models had become a mantra, a survey of empirical studies included, quote, concluded, Quote, there is no systematic evidence that same gender or same race/ethnicity role models have significant influence on a range of dependent variables that they are assumed to influence, including occupational choice, learning, and career success, end quote. Certainly, most Dunbar High School students who succeeded at Amherst College between 1892 and 1954 were unlikely to have seen a black professor. The spectacular rise of the Nisei generation of, I know I mispronounced that, sorry, the Nisei generation of Japanese Americans after World War II came at a time when they were at least equally unlikely to have been taught by a Japanese American teacher or professor, or to have seen or known a Japanese American scientist or engineer, since the majority of their parents were farmers. Although racial preferences and quotas in admissions to American colleges and universities began in the 1960s, usually without much real discussion of pros and cons, and with instant dismissal of any critics, some of those critics nevertheless made the case against such preferences at length and with considerable logical and empirical support. One of the most cogent of these critics was Professor Clyde W. Summers of the Yale Law School. Like many other critics of affirmative action, Professor Summers had in previous years written in opposition to discrimination against blacks, even before that was a popular position to take. Nor was he entirely comfortable when finding himself now arguing against affirmative action. Quote, and this is a long quote, quote, anyone who is at all aware of our historic brutal discrimination against minority groups and is sensitive to our continued pattern of deprivation wants to believe in measures which promise to open doors of opportunity and provide some recompense for past injustices. To raise questions about this program, in which so many so deeply believe, almost inevitably leads to misunderstanding, no matter how one tries to make himself understood. More troublesome, what one writes may be seized upon and used by those who seek excuses for doing nothing and thus preserving the present pattern of deprivation. End quote. Summers called preferential admissions policies, quote, an unreal solution to a real problem, end quote. His first objection was that preferential admissions, beginning at the top elite institutions, would create a nationwide mismatching of minority students and the institutions they attended, all up and down the academic pecking order. Since his own field was law, he illustrated the pattern with the admissions policies of law schools. Quote, if Harvard or Yale, for example, admitted minority students with test scores 100 to 150 points below that normally required for a non-minority student to get admitted, the total number of minority students able to get a legal education is not increased thereby. The minority students given such preferences would meet the normal admission standards at Illinois, Rutgers, or Texas. Similarly, minority students given preference at Pennsylvania would meet normal standards at Pittsburgh. Those given preference at Duke would meet normal standards at North Carolina, and those given preference at Vanderbilt would meet normal standards at Kentucky, Mississippi, and West Virginia. Thus, each law school, by its preferential admission, simply takes minority students away from other schools whose admission standards are further down the scale. In sum, the policy of preferential admission has a pervasive shifting effect, causing large numbers of minority students to attend law schools whose normal admission standards they do not meet, instead of attending other law schools whose normal standards they do meet. End quote. Because of this quote-unquote pervasive shifting effect, minority students would find themselves in serious academic difficulties all up and down the scale of law schools and other institutions, because they would be systematically mismatched with institutions at all levels. Put bluntly, many minority students with all the prerequisites for success would be artificially turned into failures because of this pervasive mismatching. This argument would for decades remain at the heart of objections to affirmative action. Attempts to get data on which to confirm or refute this argument were met by blanket refusals of academic authorities to release such information. Instead, there were assurances issued that no unqualified, quote unquote, students were being admitted, a virtually meaningless statement when coming from those who arbitrarily defined what qualified meant, without revealing what that definition is. Despite academic policies secreting the data needed to resolve this key issue, some such data did become public in one way or another. Almost invariably, such data completely undermined the academic defenders of affirmative action. At the University of California at Berkeley, for example, a 1988 study showed that the average composite scholastic aptitude test scores of black undergraduates was 952, which was above the national average of 900, but well below the university's average of 1,232 for white students and 1,254 for Asian American students. Black students with above average SAT scores cannot be called unqualified, but they were certainly mismatched. And 70% of black students failed to graduate from Berkeley. Despite rising numbers of black students at Berkeley during the 1980s, the number of black graduates declined. At MIT, the average black student's math SAT score was in the top 10% nationwide and in the bottom 10% at MIT. Nearly one-fourth of these extraordinarily high-ranking black students failed to graduate from MIT. At the University of Texas, where the average SAT score of black undergraduates was more than 100 points below that of white undergraduates, the grade point average for black freshmen was 1.97 compared to the 2.45 for white freshmen. At the Georgetown University Law School, the median test score of black students on the law school aptitude test was at the 75th percentile, again hardly unqualified, but that score was lower than the score of any white student admitted to this elite law school. Incidentally, the student who released this Georgetown data was denounced as a racist in the national media as well as on campus, despite a lack of any evidence of racism, unless the release of the data is arbitrarily defined that way, making the whole argument circular. As Professor Summers had predicted, the failures were not confined to the elite institutions. Thus, San Jose State University had 70% of its black students fail to graduate, just like Berkeley, though it is doubtful that the minority students at Berkeley would have failed at San Jose State. That is the domino effect of mismatching. Moreover, these costs of affirmative action would not stop with unnecessary academic failures among minority students. Professor Summers and others predicted back in the 60s that black students were more completely overmatched at many colleges. I'm sorry, I threw in a word that didn't exist there. Professor Summers and others predicted back in the 1960s that black students who were completely overmatched at many colleges and universities would not only find their position intolerable, but would then proceed to find academic standards and much else about academic life intolerable, leading to a shift of their focus from academics to ideological crusades on campus and beyond. Demands for relevant courses, black studies departments, and quota hiring of black faculty without regard to irrelevant academic credentials proliferated across the country, often backed up by campus disruptions and violence. As in other countries, the illusion of being able to control the course of events from the top down under affirmative action was painfully dispelled. Easier courses in black studies and in some other departments were accompanied by what Harvard professor David Reisman called affirmative grading, quote unquote. Many professors inflated grades all around, reducing failure rates and making most students A students. The credible threats represented by organized black students also tended to lead to preferential treatment of behavioral offenses. White students were not unaware of all this. As Summers and others had predicted in the 1960s, whites who saw their black classmates consistently at the bottom academically and allowed to get away with things that would not be tolerated in others began to manifest increasingly negative attitudes, despite draconian punishments for saying or doing anything that could be construed as racism, quote unquote. White students on a number of campuses have had outbursts of violence against black students of a sort unknown on those campuses in the era before preferential admissions programs and double standards on campus. Even in the absence of overt hostility, black students at MIT complained that other students there did not regard them as being desirable partners on group projects or as people to study with for tough exams. Similar reports came from other academic institutions and from black professors as well as black students. Blacks regarded as quota professors have complained of being less often invited to collaborate on research, which is crucial to their advancement. Even liberal academic supporters of affirmative action began commenting on the increasing hostility toward black students on campus and coined the term the new racism. At the heart of the problem for both black students and black professors is the unyielding fact that the numbers who have the credentials required for being at selective institutions are nowhere near the numbers required for fulfilling arbitrary quotas based on their representation in the population at large. As far back as 1969, those black professors with PhDs from top universities and numerous publications were earning more than white professors of the same description. It was just that there were not very many black professors like this. The problem was not discrimination, but inadequate numbers with the requisite qualifications. Similarly, the black students similarly with black students. When elite law schools began admitting black students preferentially in the 1960s, the total number of black students who met their usual standards, who met their what? It repeats the same phrase twice, so that may just be a typo. When elite law schools began admitting black students preferentially in the 1960s, the total number of black students who met their usual standards on law school aptitude test scores and grade point average was 39 in the entire country. 2 decades later, there were just 16. At the college level, the number of black students who scored 650 or higher on the verbal SAT was less than 700 nationwide in 1995. Most Ivy League institutions average at least 650 in verbal SAT scores. But there are not enough black students in the whole country with a 650 verbal SAT score to be admitted to the 8 Ivy League institutions in proportion to their quote unquote representation in the general population, much less to other elite institutions from coast to coast. Although test scores and grade point averages were poo-pooed as predictive factors by advocates of affirmative action, early factual studies showed the standing of black law students averaging at the 8th percentile. That is, 92% of their classmates had better academic performance in law schools. Moreover, disproportionately higher numbers of black law school students failed the bar exam, and disproportionately higher numbers of black medical school graduates failed medical licensing board exams. In the face of such mounting evidence in medicine, law, and other fields, defenders of affirmative action have argued that black doctors, lawyers, and other professionals are so much needed in black communities that it was still a good thing for them to be preferentially admitted to colleges, graduate schools, and professional schools. Nor has this argument been forced to confront the fact that many doctors who are not black serve in inner city hospitals with no evidence that black patients are any worse for that. One example who was repeatedly singled out over the years as a justification for affirmative action was a young black man named Patrick Chavez, who had been admitted under affirmative action to the medical school at the University of California at Davis, where Alan Bakke, I don't know how to pronounce that, Bakke, had been initially rejected. Chavez had gone back to practice medicine in the black community in contrast to Bakke, who went on to become an anesthesiologist in Minneapolis after graduating from the same medical school to which he was admitted in the wake of the landmark Supreme Court case that bears his name. Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts was among the many people who extolled Chavez as an example of what affirmative action was meant to accomplish. The Lawyers' Committee for Civil Rights made the usual comparison, I think there's another typo there, comparison between Chavez and Bakke to Chavez's advantage. In 1997, just 2 weeks before the Medical Board of California suspended Chavez's license to practice medicine in the wake of a suspicious death of one of his patients. The board cited Chavez's, quote, inability to perform some of the most basic duties required of a physician, end quote, according to an administrative law judge when he ordered the emergency suspension of Chavez's license. A year later, after a fuller investigation of his treatment of several patients, Chavez's license was revoked. Those who had been using Chavez as an example before now switched to the position that one isolated example does not prove anything. Unfortunately, Chavez was not an isolated example. Plans to use double standards to maneuver black students through medical school were reported to me back in 1969 and published in a 1972 book of mine. 4 years later, Professor Bernard Davis of the Harvard Medical School reported in the New England Journal of Medicine that black students there and at other medical schools were being granted diplomas, quote, on a charitable basis, end quote. He said, quote, it is cruel to admit students who have a very low probability of measuring up to reasonable standards, and that it was even crueler to abandon those standards and allow the trusting patients to pay for our irresponsibility, end quote. The only response to his revelations was a predictable denunciation of him as a racist. Discussions of college admissions policies often proceed as if the issue is the distribution of benefits to various applicants, when in fact the issue is selecting those applicants who can best master the kind and level of academic work at the particular institution. Those who see the issue as distributing benefits to applicants object to admissions, quote, criteria that benefit primarily white middle class students, end quote. Arbitrarily focusing on different groups of applicants ignores those who have the largest stake of all. In this case, people needing medical attention. In other fields as well, it is the ignored third parties who have the biggest stake in what institutions of higher learning do and how well they do it. Applicants for engineering schools do not have nearly as large a stake as those millions of other people whose lives depend on the quality of the engineering that goes into the bridges they drive across, or the planes they fly in, or the equipment they work with. Colleges and universities were not created to distribute benefits to applicants, but to develop minds and create skills that serve society at large. The criteria that matter are the criteria which best enable these institutions to carry out that responsibility, such a responsibility cannot be subordinated to the impossible task of equalizing probabilities of academic success for people born and raised in circumstances which have handicapped their development, even if for reasons that are not their fault and are beyond their control. Perhaps if we were capable of fully understanding everything that had happened to Patrick Chavis from the moment he was born, we might judge him less harshly. But the role of academic institutions is not to play God in judging individual souls. It is, among other things, to see that people like Patrick Chavis do not end up with scalpels in their hands and MD after their names to lure unsuspecting patients to their deaths. Okay, I think we've got about 9 pages left. Let me see here real quick. No, we've got 13 pages left. Whew. Man, this is going to be a long. I'm already coming up on 2 hours and I've got 13 pages to go. Yeesh. Well, I can either pause here and finish it another time or keep going. I'm inclined to just plow through it. You know what? Fuck that. I grew up in an environment that was complete anathema to my intellectual development and still managed to excel in academics. Yeah, exactly. It's I I'm kind of with you. It can it be a factor? Sure, if you let it be. And a lot of people do, but it doesn't have to be. And there are great examples of people that came from nothing that became, you know, intellectual giants. Some people possess more aptitude than others. It is a sad part of life, but it's true. Yeah, it is absolutely true. There are just and it all depends on the subject too. There are subjects that people excel at, but it isn't what they think they need to go into, so they don't pursue it. Anyway, I am inclined to just keep on trucking on this and finish it up so that I can finish this book on Tuesday. So I'm going to keep going. So if you need to cut out, if anybody needs to cut out, this will be this will be on YouTube later, so you can always pick up where you left off. All right, so empirical studies. While many of the crucial assumptions behind preferences and quotas are widely accepted without evidence being asked or given, there have been some empirical studies which bear on these assumptions. However, the same uncritical acceptance which has allowed conclusions favorable to affirmative action to prevail without evidence has also allowed studies done in questionable ways to be accepted as proof when those studies reached conclusions favorable to the to the continuance of group preferences and quotas. But even in a shitty environment, the talented will still find a way in many cases. Absolutely. There are a whole lot of people that have become very successful that didn't get any kind of formal education. They just spent a lot of time at the library. One of the most continuing. One of the most widely praised of these exercises in defense of affirmative action in the academic world was the 1998 book The Shape of the River by former university presidents William Bowen and Derek Bok of Princeton and Harvard respectively. This book's premise was that admitting black applicants to colleges and universities with lower qualifications than those required of other applicants has not produced the bad results claimed by critics of affirmative action. The authors mobilized and displayed voluminous statistics in an attempt to show that such students succeeded academically and succeeded later in life. Unfortunately, however, these many statistics, tables, graphs, and equations were not about black students who were admitted with lower qualifications than other students. They were about black students in general in the institutions covered, including black students admitted under the same standards as white students. This much touted study is Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. I like that. The controversies about preferences and quotas in college admissions were not about whether any black student would be admitted to colleges, but is precisely about the admission of those particular black students who do not meet the normal standards applied to other students at the particular institutions they attend. The failure of Bowen and Bach to single out such students raises the first of many serious questions about their study, especially since other studies have separated out such students and found the opposite of what Bowen and Bach claim to have found. Submerging black students who were admitted with lower qualifications in broad statistics about black students in general is particularly suspicious when the raw data behind the published numbers are not available to others, who might break down the statistics differently and get at the key information that these authors excluded. Scholars whose request for the same data was flatly denied noted that Bowen and Bach had, quote, access to student records that schools have never made available to investigators before, end quote. While the institutional decision to release this data only to two longtime defenders of affirmative action raises doubts, the way the statistics were then used casts a further cloud over the Bowen-Bach study. The sample used in the Bowen-Bach study consists of 24 private and just 4 public institutions of higher education, when in fact only 9% of black students attend private institutions, which constitute the bulk of the Bowen-Bach sample. Moreover, other minorities such as Hispanics and Asians are omitted from the study. As for the black students in this sample, 64% had at least one parent who had graduated from college, more than 5 times the proportion among all black college-age youths. In short, Bowen and Bach used a highly atypical sample of minority students attending highly atypical colleges and universities, and from this they draw conclusions about affirmative action admissions policies in general, despite a pro forma caveat against this early in the preface. More specifically, Bowen and Bach deny the claims of critics of affirmative action that minority students admitted under lower standards, 1, do not perform as well as other students, 2, do not survive to graduate as well as often, and 3, do not do as well in their post-college careers. The key problem seen by these critics is that minority students admitted to elite institutions under lower standards are mismatched rather than unqualified, and could have been more successful at other institutions geared to students of their own academic ability levels, many of which colleges and universities are good institutions. In short, the argument is that there is no point failing at a big name institution when you can succeed at a good quality institution without such a big name. How do Bowen and Bach answer such critics of preferential admissions policies? First of all, actually, before I say that, there is one thing that brings to mind. I'll read what you wrote here. One of the biggest harms of these programs is that people in those demographic subsets who are more talented will be overlooked for those who have more wealth or influence. Yeah, and that is actually what he was talking about earlier. The people that are already more well off financially um, benefiting more than people that are less financially whatever. Lost the word. So what I was going to say is part of the problem. He's talking about being mismatched and not doing as well in a institute with a big name, instead of going to one that's good quality that you would do better at. I have met people, and I know one woman in particular, a black woman married to my best white friend, um, that is absolutely obsessed with the name and the perceived quality of the university rather than the quality of the education. Um, so when her husband quit work to go to college, instead of going to the state school, she insisted that he had to go to this other big name school in the same area that cost 3 times as much, um, because she was so obsessed with the name of the school when it really doesn't make that much difference in the long run. Anyway, moving on. Moving on. How do Bowen and Bach answer such critics of preferential admissions policies? First of all, the shape of the river redefines preferences and quotas as, quote, race sensitive admissions, end quote. And Rowan and Bach say that they are against quotas, which apparently means that they are against the word quotas, since they make the usual arguments for numerical representation and assert, without evidence, the educational benefits of diversity. Diversity. Their most triumphant finding is that black students, quote, graduated at higher rates the more selective the school that they attended, end quote. Emphasis in the original. The implication is that mismatching does not hurt black students' prospects of graduating after all, but closer scrutiny reveals a very different story. As Bowen and Bach themselves say elsewhere, quote, there has been a much more pronounced narrowing of the black-white gap in SAT scores among applicants to the most selective colleges, end quote. This is substantiated more clearly by data from others' research, which show that the gap between black and white composite SAT scores has been 95 points at Harvard, but 184 points at Duke and 271 points at Rice. The crucial question is not how selective the college is, but how wide is the gap between the qualifications of its black students and the normal standards of the institution, as indicated by the qualifications of the other students. A study of racial differences among students in state colleges and universities in Colorado found that although in general a higher percentage of whites than blacks graduated within a 6-year period, 50% of blacks and 48% of whites graduated within that span at the University of Colorado at Denver, where the difference in SAT scores was only 30 points. Where there were negligible differences in test scores, there were negligible differences in graduation rates. In Colorado, it so happened that there were smaller differences in test scores at the lower ranked institution. At the flagship University of Colorado campus at Boulder, where the test score differences between blacks and whites was more than 200 points, only 39% of the black students graduated compared to 72% of the whites. Clearly, racial preferences were greater at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where 75% of both black and white applicants were accepted, despite a 205-point difference in SAT scores. Meanwhile, at the University of Colorado at Denver, only 68% of black applicants were accepted, some compared to 82% of white applicants, leading to a student body with only negligible differences in test scores between black and white students, and negligible differences in graduation rates. A study of 5 state-run medical schools around the country found similar patterns. Among these 5 medical schools, black-white differences in scores on the medical college admission test were greatest at the medical school at the State University of New York in Brooklyn, and least at the medical school at the University of Washington. The racial differences difference in the percentage of students later passing the U.S. medical licensing examination was likewise greatest at SUNY Brooklyn, 20 percentage points difference, and least at the University of Washington, 9 points difference. Even this understates the difference between the institutions, since 25% of the black medical students at SUNY Brooklyn did not even take the U.S. medical licensing examination, compared to 10% at the University of Washington. Although Although blacks in general have had a higher rate of dismissal from medical residency programs than other groups, those particular blacks with academic credentials comparable to whites have had dismissal rates comparable to whites. Although black physicians in general obtained board certification only half as often as white physicians, those black physicians who had college grades and medical college admissions test scores comparable to those of white physicians actually obtained board certification more often than whites. In short, the crucial factor in the success or failure of black students has not been whether an institution was highly ranked or lower ranked, but whether the gap between the qualifications of black and other students was large or small. Bowen and Bach, however, consider their sample results, quote, much more conclusive, end quote, than other studies, though apparently not so conclusive that the raw data can be allowed to be seen by other researchers. Yet their results not only differ from what others have found in studies of particular institutions, they differ from national patterns. Quote, blacks with SAT scores between 851 and 1000 have a 77% graduation rate from colleges whose overall SAT average is 900. By contrast, blacks who score between 700 and 850 on the SAT graduate from those same schools only 56% of the time, and blacks whose SAT scores are below 700 have just a 38% chance of graduating, end quote. The institutions compared by Bowen and Bach differ in more than just test scores. The most selective group of institutions, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, and the like, average an undergraduate student body of fewer than 3,000 students, while the least selective group of institutions in this particular sample, Michigan, Penn State, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, etc., averaged more than 13,000 undergraduates. Indeed, the largest number of undergraduates on any campus in the first group was smaller than the median number of undergraduates on campuses in the second group. Moreover, even the least selective set of institutions in the Bowen-Bach sample are by no means mediocre. They appear regularly in various lists of leading American universities, and no one considers them average. Given this context, what the Bowen and Bach data show is that within a very narrow range of institutions, black students who attend the most elite institutions, whose average size is less than one-fourth of that in another set of elite institutions, graduated at a higher rate. This may say more about large versus small undergraduate institutions, especially for students who may need more individual help from their professors than about anything else. A well-known study of college students found that their satisfaction with faculty was inversely related to the size of the college or university. Data from other sources reinforce the importance of college size in the survival rates of black students. For example, I think we're about to go into an ad again, sorry. For example, 13% of black students at Stanford failed to graduate in 6 years compared to 42% who failed to graduate in the same time at the University of California at Berkeley. There were nearly 3 times as many undergraduates at Berkeley as at Stanford, and the student-faculty ratio at Berkeley was more than double the Stanford ratio. Similarly, 12% of black students attending Yale failed to graduate in 6 years, compared to 41% at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Here again, Michigan's student faculty ratio was more than double that at Yale, and there were 4 times as many undergraduates at Ann Arbor. The conclusions of the Bowen-Bach study. Oh, here we go. We're into an ad. So I am actually going to go refill my water while the ad's on. I'll be right back. Okay, we're back. Um, so, the conclusions of the Bowen-Bach study are further undermined by the nature of their sample of institutions as well as by their atypical sample of students, because their comparison is between different sets of elite institutions with different average SAT scores, but with all having scores above the national average. This creates without this creates what statisticians call the restricted range problem. You cannot tell the general importance of some factor by seeing what difference it makes in a sample where there is only a very limited range of variation in that factor. For example, you may find very little correlation between height and performance among professional basketball players, but professional basketball players as a group are much taller than most other people. So the fact that a player who is 6 foot 11 inches tall is just as good as another player who is 7 foot 2 inches tall does not disprove the role of height in basketball. No one would hire a midget to play professional basketball because his words, not mine. Nobody get all butthurt over that. Um, to play professional basketball because of a low correlation between height and performance among existing basketball players. Bode and Bach point out that even the lowest score black students graduate at a higher rate in their sample of the most elite institutions than in other elite institutions in their sample. This might be more weighty evidence if was not one based on such an atypical sample of students and institutions, and two, contradicted by so much evidence based on others' statistics that were not such tightly held secrets. What makes affirmative action urgently needed, according to Bowen and Bach, is that one, without it, few black students would be admitted to the most elite colleges and universities, and that two, these particular institutions are the gateways to high-level professions in which blacks are currently underrepresented, so that otherwise these young blacks' prospects are bleak. A critic has parodied this argument as suggesting that it's Yale or jail, quote unquote. So long as the big name colleges and universities are able to acquire a disproportionate share of the best qualified black students, it should not be surprising that such students do well after graduation. The only meaningful question is whether such students would have done well at other colleges whose normal admission standards they met. Many lesser known colleges have outperformed big name colleges when it comes to getting their graduates into top postgraduate earning PhDs or ending up in Who's Who in America. In the case of black students, there is a whole history of their going to predominantly black colleges, none of which is ranked in the top tier for generations on end. Today, black colleges enroll only about one-fourth of all black students in higher education, but their graduates receive 40% of all science and engineering degrees received by black students nationwide. Of the 10 undergraduate institutions whose black students go on to receive the most PhDs in science, 6 are black institutions. Apparently, it is not Yale or Yale after all. In fact, none of the institutions in the large Bowen-Bach sample was among the top 10 as the undergraduate home of black PhDs, and only one, the University of Michigan, was among the top 18. Again, this is salient. What is salient is not simply that the Bowen-Bach thesis is inconsistent with the empirical facts, but that it was so widely accepted with the relevant facts being neither asked for nor given. Okay, we're getting there. Post-affirmative action results. In 1995, racial preferences and quotas in university admissions were banned by the regents of the University of California, and in 1996, a statewide referendum confirmed that ban. In Texas, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals banned preferential admissions at the University of Texas Law School in 1996. In both states, there were predictions of dire consequences. President Bill Clinton said that the California ban on group preferences would resegregate, quote unquote, the universities. Jesse Jackson likewise spoke of a, quote, radical resegregation of our schools and reduction in opportunity, end quote, and called the ban on affirmative action ethnic cleansing. Much the same message was echoed by many others. What actually happened? Black freshman enrollment in the flagship of the University of California system, the Berkeley campus, dropped substantially. So did black freshman enrollment at the other leading campuses of the system, UCLA. However, these did not represent similar reductions in the total number of black freshmen going to college in the University of California system as a whole. Moreover, the UC system is not the only state-supported university system in California. There is also the California State University system, which in fact enrolls more students. Within the University of California system as a whole, the enrollment of black freshmen dropped from 917 in 1997 to 739 the following year, but rose again to 832 in the year 2000, a decline of 9% over this period, and then rose to 936 in 2002. While there was only a temporary and relatively modest decline in the number of black freshmen throughout the University of California system as a whole, on the flagship Berkeley campus, the decline was much sharper. From 222 in 1996 to 122 in 1999, and the recovery was only to 142 by the year 2002. At UCLA, the decline from 230 black freshmen in 1996 was likewise never fully recovered, and by 2002, there were just 161 black freshmen on that campus. However, on some other campuses within the University of California system, Santa Barbara, Riverside, Irvine, Santa Cruz, there were increases in the number of black freshmen. What this meant was that black students redistributed themselves within the University of California system with no net decline at all between 1996 and 2002. It was much the same story in the California State University system, where there were more black freshmen enrolled in 2002 than there had been back in 1996, before the end of affirmative action. A fact receiving remarkably little attention or comment in the media, which had widely publicized earlier hysterical claims about an impending resegregation of higher education. And they're doing it again now, aren't they? In the University of Texas system, there was likewise a decline in black undergraduate enrollment at the flagship campus in Austin, but a rise on almost every other campus. In 1996, there were 1,479 black undergraduates enrolled on the Austin campus, and that fell to 1,298 by 2000, a decline of 12%. But for the University of Texas system as a whole, the total number of black undergraduates rose from 5,250 to 5,657. Although the total number of undergraduates in the system also rose over these same years, black undergraduates nevertheless increased from 4.6% of all undergraduates to 4.8%. In short, despite many hysterical media reports and dire predictions of minorities losing access to higher education in the wake of bans on affirmative action, there were very modest changes in the numbers and proportions of black students in the state university systems of both California and Texas, and in the end, a rise. The more substantial change was in black students' redistribution among the campuses within these systems. The crucial question, however, is not how many black or other minority students are on campus at any given moment, but how many graduate. There may well be more minority graduates now that minority students are no longer so mismatched with the institutions they're attending. Existing data on variations in test score differences and graduation rate differences already point in that direction, but data on survival to graduation have not yet been forthcoming and may never be forthcoming if such data substantiate what critics of affirmative action have been saying for decades. While there are more data available for making comparisons between blacks and whites and among other racial or ethnic groups, there is also a vast amount of data on Asian Americans. However, proponents of affirmative action tend to avoid discussing Asian Americans, even though Asian American experiences might be very relevant to testing many of the theories behind affirmative action. Indeed, the experiences of Asian Americans often flatly contradict much that is said by those making a case for affirmative action. For example, black-white differences in test scores are often attributed to cultural biases in the test favoring white middle-class students. Yet a higher percentage of Asian American students score above 700 on the mathematics SAT than among whites, despite an emphasis on the lower incomes of the families of black students as a factor in these students' lower test scores. Asian American students from families with low income average higher than students on the mathematics portion of the SAT. I totally butchered that sentence. I'm sorry. Let me start it over. Despite an emphasis on the lower incomes of the families of black students as a factor in these students' lower test scores, Asian American students from families with lower incomes average higher scores on the mathematics portions of the SAT than black students from high income families. Claims of culturally biased tests are also used to back up the claim that these tests underestimate the future performances of black students. Although such claims have been refuted repeatedly for black students, it is a claim that has in fact turned out to be true for Asian American students who outperform whites with the same IQs in academic institutions and in their later careers. But those who use the unsubstantiated allegation that blacks will perform better than their scores indicate, and so should be admitted to colleges and universities with lesser scores than whites, never use the empirically verified fact that Asian Americans perform better than whites with the same scores to argue for larger quotas for Asian Americans. Finally, the argument is often made that objections to affirmative action are due to angry white males, quote unquote, who resent blacks taking places in college that would normally go to them. In reality, Asian Americans take more places than blacks in many leading colleges and universities, and especially in engineering schools. They have outnumbered blacks at 7 of the 8 Ivy League colleges and on all 9 campuses of the University of California, as well as at Stanford, the University of Chicago, and Caltech, among other places. Yet, there is no such backlash against Asian Americans who are admitted without any group preferences and quotas. This suggests that it is not the places but the processes that are resented. Again, however, it is not a question of one set of evidence against another, but of one set of beliefs becoming prevailing dogma without evidence being either asked or given. And finally, summary and implications. Woo! We're going to make it. In the United States, as in other countries, the rationale for affirmative action has had little to do with its actual operation or consequences. Supposedly, a means to redress the harm created by discrimination in the past, preferences and quotas established under affirmative action policies require neither the individual beneficiary nor even the group from which the individual comes to demonstrate any specific harm from prior discrimination. Thus, recent immigrants from Asia or Latin America are eligible for affirmative action benefits in the United States, though obviously there was no past discrimination against these individuals or their forebears in this country, simply because were not living in this country. Moreover, even among blacks, benefits to black millionaires under affirmative action are far more demonstrable than benefits to blacks in poverty. Rationales produce political support, but the policy produces results far removed from those rationales. The costs of affirmative action are as seldom scrutinized as to the benefits or alleged benefits. Among the costs are lowered standards of performance in order to get numerical results. Moreover, these standards are sometimes lowered for all in order to avoid the political embarrassment or legal liability of obvious double standards for favored groups. Grading systems may be changed to pass, fail, or grade inflation may occur all around. Physical strength requirements may be reduced so that more women can be hired, but if that requirement is reduced for all, then that can lead to more men as well as women with inadequate strength in such life and death occupations as firefighters, soldiers, or policemen. Indeed, there may be more low performing men than low performing women in some fields after the physical standards are lowered to allow more women to become eligible. In addition to the hostilities between groups created or exacerbated by preferences and quotas in other countries, affirmative action in the United States has made blacks, who have largely lifted themselves out of poverty, look like people who owe their rise to affirmative action and other government programs. Moreover, this perception is not confined to whites. It has been carefully cultivated by black politicians and civil rights leaders who seek to claim credit for the progress so as to solidify a constituency conditioned to be dependent on them as well as on government. In this context, there has been a virtual moratorium on recognition of achievement by blacks except insofar as they are collective political milestones or otherwise serve current ideological or political interests. Thus, despite such hand-wringing and much hand-wringing and finger-pointing over the abysmal educational performances of black students in ghetto schools, there has been at best utter indifference among black organizations and movements to documented examples of black schools that have been academically successful. Nor has there been much interest in the fact that some very ordinary black schools in Harlem performed as well on citywide tests in the 1940s as the predominantly white working class schools on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Much less that a black high school in Washington outperformed most white high schools in D.C. as far back as 1899, while the rise of many predominant individuals from the Lower East Side of Manhattan has been justly celebrated. There has been little or no interest in blacks who have done the same thing, for that would be a distraction from the politics of grievances and demands. The transparent dishonesty with which quotas and preferences have been instituted and maintained, a dishonesty reaching into the highest court in the land, as the Weber case, among others, demonstrates, has produced cynicism and bitterness. As another insult adding to injury, airs of moral superiority on the part of those perpetrating deception add to a galling sense of grievance among many people who are part of the non-preferred population. That all of this has done relatively little for the genuinely poor in ghettos and barrios across the United States is part of the painful irony of the situation. Many defenders of affirmative action ignore or dismiss unwelcome facts in favor of more palatable assumptions. Thus, higher failure rates for blacks on bar exams or medical board exams are taken as evidence that there is something wrong with those exams. Fewer blacks made partners in big law firms mean that there is something wrong with those law firms, and so on down the line. The very possibility that preferential policies may have put some people in settings where their chances of success are reduced is arbitrarily banished from the realm of possibility. Affirmative action continues to be judged by its rationales rather than its results. And that is the end of the chapter. We made it. We made it. What was that? Or we were like 3 hours in? 2 hours and 33 minutes in. That's the longest reading I think I've ever done. Okay. I'm done. I'm wasted for the night. I don't even want to raid anybody at this point. I just want to sit back with a nice cocktail and be done. So, I am just going to end it there, and we will come back on Tuesday, read the final chapter, which is titled The Past and the Future. Hopefully it'll be a bit shorter. And thank you, Vesper, for coming in. I have really got to... I know I can do this. I can do this. I'm going to do it. I'm going to give you a shout out, even though I suck at it, and I never do it right the first try, but I will succeed this time. Just might take me a minute here. Let's see if I did it right. I did it! All right. Troy can learn. Okay, so on that note, thank you all for coming in once more, and I will see you Tuesday. No, Monday. Star Wars reading is Monday. Tuesday is the conclusion of this book. Have a good night.
Shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not nights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. So myself. sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's enough. Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes. Wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's enough. Not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's enough. Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes. Wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated